Ambassador of the Netherlands, and we are here to celebrate the sort of a handoff of the presidency. I'm the presidency for another roughly 10 hours, I think, or something like that, and then somebody else will realize how nice it is to be president. In all fairness, there's a big difference between being president in a city here like Washington away from the European Union and being a president either in Brussels or in our case in The Hague, where you can be assured that life will be slightly busier because of the presidency there than here. You see two logos on the screen. You did not have Slovakia, the presidency before us, so that's an original new logo. Everybody who knows something about the EU knows that we were not that original. Our logo was the same as we used in 2004. We changed the numbers luckily. We'll have a presidency in, let's say, 12, 13 years' time again. I'm sure you will see this again, so you can get used to it. Anyway, welcome especially to my Slovak colleague Peter Kmec, Richard Wike, who will tell us something about his study, David O'Sullivan, Ambassador of the EU. And as I said, we are here to mark very briefly and more in the form of a seminar introduction, the handover of the presidency. If I think about it, and we look back on the last half year, I'm reminded of the words of the British, how appropriate, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who was asked at a certain moment, what influences your policy now the most? And his answer was, events, boy, events. And if I think about our presidency for the past half year, I think I could give you exactly the same answer. We are Dutch. We like to prepare and prepare well, and I can tell you we had 16, 17 scenarios in the cupboard which, under all kinds of circumstances, we would play out, and none of the scenarios covered the events that shaped our presidency. And in a way, and I'll say that to my friend Peter as well, that's a pity, but you shouldn't mind in a way, because our presidency will unfortunately not be remembered for the fact that we made an agreement to tackle resistance against antibiotics. It will not be remembered on an agreement that all the research funded by public money will be open to the public starting in 2020. It will not be remembered for the Pact of Amsterdam, for urban development, where we said that EU institutions, the governments, the cities would work together to give a bigger place in decision-making for urban centers. It will not be remembered for the two agreements that we made to tackle fiscal flight and to make sure that everybody pays a fair amount of taxes. It will definitely not be remembered for the fourth railway package, which nobody understands until you're a real expert. And it will also not be remembered for the agreement we made among 9 member states on wind energy on the North Sea. Those agreements will have a lasting effect in many ways on the way Europeans live, and I think it will make the ways Europeans live better. Unfortunately, our presidency will be remembered for the refugee crisis and for the vote of the British people about a week ago. That's what we will be remembered for, and those are the events Harold Macmillan already at that time had in mind as the lasting impressions that presidency is given to you as a good housefly. It's given to you. Your task will be to further the cause of the European Union and to make the European Union better. And I think that the examples I gave you are the real examples, and I'm very, very sure that if you lie in a hospital at a certain moment and you'll be administered the drugs that are resistant to antibiotics, you'll be a lot happier for the decision taken during the Dutch presidency or implemented during the Slovak presidency than a lot of the other decisions which will have made the headlines, but were not as lasting as those decisions. Therefore, I hope that the Slovak presidency can resist the temptation, I'm sure you will, to look for maybe the spotlights, but treat the European Union as it should be treated, which is, as a fantastic organization, the biggest project, democracy project, I think, in the world for as long as we have known it. A very successful project that has given us who live in Europe more than 70 years of peace and prosperity and a life worth living, which has given us here in the transatlantic community a partner on the other side of the ocean with whom we could share our prosperity and our peace. And therefore, I think that I entrust to you a European Union which we might say is bruised but not beaten, a European Union that always rises to the occasion. Famous words, of course, come from this country. What's it again? When the going gets tough, going, then we might think a little bit in the pattern realm or whatever, but okay, you don't have to adopt that immediately. But know that on those occasions, the European Union will shine, and I'll be sure and happy to know that those occasions will be under the Slovak leadership, under the Slovak presidency, and therefore I'm entrust to you, so to say, the presidency of the European Union for a very small part in Washington, to you here, Peter, and for a much bigger part to your government in Brussels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henne. Before I say a couple of words as an introduction to Slovakian presidency, I would like to ask for a short promotional video.
For us, this sound holds immense emotional value. This sound symbolizes life, love, and Slovakia. Slovakia has traditionally seen itself as the heart of Europe. For the next 6 months, its pulse will become the pulse of the entire European Union. We have many ideas and even more ambitions. And yet, we're not only concerned with how our presidency will help Slovakia. We're asking, plain and simple, what will our presidency bring to the European Union? This is our answer. We will work hard, systematically and persistently on issues that are important to all EU member states and their citizens. We have a clear plan for tackling priority issues. We are determined to help Europe avoid fragmentation and enhance resilience. We will pay particular attention to making the migration and asylum policies sustainable. We want Europe to be prepared for investments and new jobs. This is why we will focus on creating the right environment that allows European projects to get off the ground. How? By mobilizing investment tools, by deepening the economic and monetary union, by helping small and medium-sized enterprises within the capital markets union, and by strengthening the banking union. Since we understand what connected Europe means, we will devote our efforts to common European projects, such as the single market, the energy union, and the digital single market. We will therefore focus on challenges that require a common approach and common European solutions. Such challenges include the previously mentioned sustainable migration policy, as well as the European neighbourhood policy and EU enlargement. These are the issues where, acting as an honest broker, we will seek solutions benefiting the entire Union. As Presidency, we will be chairing one of the three main EU institutions, the Council of the European Union, which represents the EU's 28 member states. The meetings at different levels, from technical to ministerial, will take place in Brussels, Luxembourg, and Bratislava. And in doing so, we will show you Slovakia, her beauties, charms, and secrets. Slovakia, the country holding the presidency of the Council of the European Union from the 1st of July to the 31st of December. Slovakia, recharging Europe.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again, and Henne, thank you very much for organizing this event. It's a really remarkable event for Slovakia as an EU member state. Know that we have been EU member state relatively short period of time, 12 years, and this is our first ever presidency compared to the 12th Dutch EU presidency. So. Therefore, we will rely on, I personally will rely on Henne's advice a lot. And of course, we have a great support of the EU delegation, Washington DC, led by David O'Sullivan. So, very strong team that we can work with. The accession of Slovakia to the EU has provided the country with political and economic boost. Today, we are at the very core of the European integration. We are actively shaping the EU policies, and we are contributing to the economic growth on the continent. On the other hand, most of our time in the EU, we have been in a crisis management mode. Europe was tested by the economic and financial crisis, Russia's annexation of part of Ukraine, and most recently by the unprecedented migration and refugee crisis. The three biggest challenges that Slovakia will be facing during the presidency are migration, terrorism, and above all the aftermath of the UK referendum. So these will be the highlights of the presidency that will be actually somehow overshadowed our priorities, and there are plenty of areas where we would like to make the Union better, stronger, and more prosperous, but sometimes things happen that we have to deal with these kind of unpredictable priorities that meet the many recommendations for the forthcoming presidency, expect unexpected. And that's happened. So this is the situation exactly we now face with the UK. For the first time in the EU history, we are confronted with practicalities and political ramifications of a member state willing to leave the European Union. While we fully respect the result, our ambition will be to deal with the outcome pragmatically, without unreasonable prolongations, engaging in professional negotiations with the UK by applying the existing law. The current situation clearly shows that EU needs to implement its agreements more effectively. Unless we improve and become more responsible in a way we implement our commitments, many citizens will remain unconvinced of the ability of the EU to address their concerns and the problems of everyday life. Yesterday, the informal meeting of 27 EU heads of state or government decided to start a political reflection to give an impulse to further reforms that will be based on our strategic agenda. Next informal meeting of the heads of states and core government will be held in September in Bratislava. I will now move to the priorities of the Slovak presidency that might not be actually remembered after we finish our presidency, but we find them really very important, very significant to keep the European Union strong. So first priority cluster will be economically strong Europe. We will aim at deepening of the economic and monetary union that will help increase competitiveness. Negotiations about the union's budgets for 2017 and the building of the capital markets union will also be high on our agenda. Economic growth in Europe also depends on trade with crucial partners like the United States. And in this context, we will do our best to move forward the TTIP agenda, though we have the ramifications of the UK referendum in this context as well. But the determination to conclude the negotiations sooner than later still exists on both sides. The second priority cluster is modern single market. The presidency is committed to substantially move forward the two flagship projects that are in progress, and in 2016 they are supposed to be adopted. One is the energy union, and the second is digital single market. When it comes to building the digital market, Slovakia will prioritize the elimination of barriers to digital economy, the facilitation of the use of electronic services and access to the market, the availability of electronic content, as well as a high level of consumer protection. The third priority package is sustainable migration and asylum policy. In the area of migration, the Slovak presidency will focus on the implementation of the EU external border protection policy and the integrity of the Schengen area. The presidency will promote positive agendas such as Smart Borders package, which seeks to contribute to the fight against irregular migration and speed up passenger processing times through the use of modern technologies. Last but not least, we will focus on globally engaged Europe. So besides the EU global agenda that has been adopted on the level of the European Commission, and it will be discussed further, we'll look into the crisis and instability that mark the developments in our neighborhood. In fact, many challenges that we are confronting with inside the European Union, such as migration or terrorism, have their roots outside Europe. Mostly in the violence that traumatizes Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and many other countries. A lot of focus will remain on the situation in Ukraine. We'll try to use our EU neighborhood and enlargement policy tools to make Europe even stronger, safer, and more prosperous. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks very much for hosting this event. I'm Richard Wike from the Pew Research Center. It's a real honor to be here and to have an opportunity to talk about some of our research, and in particular, this report on Europe's place in the world. As you may know, we conduct an annual global attitude survey each year at the Pew Research Center. this year we decided to really place a focus on Europe, and we put out this report a few weeks ago that really focuses on what Europeans think about engaging with other countries and with the rest of the world. We put out a report yesterday, actually, that looks at attitudes in Europe and in Asia as well towards the United States, including views of President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump. And we will put out a report in a few weeks looking at views on the refugee issue in Europe, attitudes towards minority groups, and attitudes about national identity. So our hope is that through a series of reports, we're able to take a good look at European public opinion on a lot of very important issues that are being debated in Europe and elsewhere right now. So, hopefully this is a good contribution to these debates. I'll tell you about this report mostly today that again looks at European attitudes towards international engagement. I'll sort of walk through some of the key findings from that report. Before I do so, let me tell you a little bit about the Pew Research Center and who we are and what we do. We're basically a think tank based here in Washington. We've been around 20 years now. We're funded largely by the Pew Charitable Trust, although also some other private foundations. As it says here, we're non-profit, non-advocacy. We don't get involved in policy debates or make policy recommendations. We like to call ourselves a fact tank rather than a think tank because we put such an emphasis on data and empirical research. And as you can see here, we've been doing international surveys since 2002, and we've been in 93 different countries now, and I think we'll be able to add a couple more to that list over the next year or two. Now, in terms of the methodology for this report, it was conducted in 10 European Union countries in April and May. In most of these countries, we do telephone surveys, although we also do face-to-face interviews in a few countries as well. And it's important to know that these are all nationally representative samples. So the people in our samples, in terms of their demographic profile, it looks like the population as a whole. So it's representative of the population of these countries. And I'm happy to talk more during the Q&A about the methodology and how we go about doing this type of work. One of the things that we did want to look at in this survey is broad attitudes towards international engagement. So we asked a number of different questions on the survey to try to gauge that in different ways, including this one, which I think taps into sort of a dimension of, do people want to look outward towards the rest of the world, or do they want to focus in an inward direction? So we asked people, what do you think? Should our country deal with its own problems and let other countries deal with theirs as best they can, or should we focus on helping other countries? So if you look down at the bottom of that bar chart there, it gives you the median across all 10 countries that we surveyed. So, looking overall across these 10 countries, people in these nations are leaning inward a little bit, saying that we need to focus on our own problems and let other countries kind of get by as best they can. But as you'll see, it also varies a lot across these 10 countries as well. So if you look at Greece and Hungary, we've had about 8 and 10 saying we need to focus on our own problems. In contrast, down at the bottom here, you have Sweden, Germany, Spain, where you have a little bit more than half saying we need to focus on working with other countries too. And as you'll see as we go through a few of these slides, the sort of distribution of countries that we see here is something that we see pretty regularly, in that it's Greece, Hungary, Italy, Poland that group together quite often. France and the UK in the middle, and then often it's the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, and Spain who cluster together. So that's not it's not 100% true across all these slides, but it's a pattern we see on a number of different questions, including some of the questions that we asked on in this report, but in others as well. So another issue that we want to look at in terms of engagement is economic engagement. So we asked people, this question is actually the same question in the United States I want to share with you first, which shows that Americans are right about at the European median in terms of this question about looking inward or looking outward. You've got 57% of Americans who say we ought to be really kind of focusing on our own problems. And then if you look over the right of the screen, what you can see is a pretty familiar pattern if you look at just about anything regarding American public opinion, which is that there are some substantial partisan gaps. Democrats are almost equally divided in terms of looking inward or outward, and independents and Republicans much more likely to say, let's focus on our own problems. So, one of many areas where in the U.S. we see some big partisan and ideological divisions. Here's a question about economic engagement with the rest of the world. So, what do you think? Do you think engaging economically with other countries is a bad thing because it costs jobs, or is it a good thing because it creates markets and it leads to growth? And on balance, in most of the countries that we included in this year's survey, we see that people say it's a good thing. And there's a lot of discussion about certain segments of society in Europe and elsewhere. Who've been left behind by globalization and maybe turning against it. But in broad terms, we still see a lot of support for economic globalization. And there are some outliers. Greece is one that is an outlier, especially on lots of questions we ask about economic issues, as you might expect. But by and large, we see a lot of support for economic globalization. You can see the United States down at the bottom here, a little bit more negative about economic globalization than what we see in much of Europe. Another thing we wanted to look at is how do people assess their own country's kind of role in the world and its influence in international affairs and the trajectory of that influence. So what do you think about your country? Is it more important than it was a decade ago, as important, or less important? And when we ask that, as you can see, we get some pretty different responses across these countries. In Greece, in Italy, Spain, France, you've got majorities or pluralities saying that our country is not as important as it used to be. And if you look down at the bottom of the screen, it's a different picture. In Poland, where you've got a plurality there saying we're actually more important. And then the big exception really is Germany, where 62% say we're playing a more important role in world affairs than we used to a decade ago, which I think fits into some of the dynamics about European economics and politics we've all observed. But it's interesting to see that this is also registering in terms of public opinion in Germany. Same question in the United States, and what's interesting here is that there's actually a trend line on this question going back to the mid-1970s. And as you can see from the chart, what we've seen the last couple of times we've asked this question is that there are record highs, essentially, in terms of the percentage of Americans who say our country is less important than it used to be. So, been a lot of debates about the status of American power, the direction of American power in recent years, and this is also something that seems to be registering in terms of public opinion here in the U.S. Now, you can see the trend line's also headed down a little bit from the high of that a couple of years ago, so that's something we'll want to keep seeing and keep measuring to see if Americans start becoming a little bit more confident. Now, here's a question not about your country, but about the European Union. Would you like to see the European Union play a more active or less active role in world affairs? And I thought this question was really interesting. Majorities in every single country, including some really large majorities in some countries, say, we'd like to see the European Union play a bigger role on the world stage. So, this is happening at a time when we know that, from some of the earlier questions we were looking at, a lot of people kind of want to pull back from the world. And we also know from other questions we've asked that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the European Union in lots of ways, right? There's a lot of negative frustration with certain aspects of the European Union. Nonetheless, people, even in the UK, as you can see there, 55% say, we want the European Union to play a bigger role in world affairs. So there's still this aspiration that the European Union can do some positive good in the international arena. We also wanted to sort of take stock of what people say they see as the biggest threats facing their country. So we read people a list of potential threats and asked them to rate each one and how big of a threat they think it is to their country. So this is the percentages in the United States and the median percentages across the 10 European Union countries, saying each of these things is a major threat to their country. So when we do this, we see that ISIS rises to the top, both in the United States and in Europe, which is, in some ways is very surprising. In other ways, this is a group that no one had ever really heard of for the most part in terms of public opinion 2 years ago. And yet very quickly they're the top threat in the United States and the top threat in Europe and the top threat even in many other parts of the world that we survey. So ISIS is at the top, and then you get some differences between the United States and Europe with the other threats. Climate change comes in second among Europeans, a lower priority among Americans. Americans are more concerned about cyber attacks than Europeans. The refugee issue, actually Americans are more likely to say they're worried about it than Europeans. It's sort of in the middle of the pack here, although we know this is an important concern, and like I said, we have some other data coming out regarding the refugee issue in a few weeks. If you look at Russia, something that's been a very high-profile issue, of course, for the United States and for the EU in recent years, but in terms of public opinion, it doesn't register as highly as some of these other things, like climate change or ISIS or other concerns. Human rights and development issues is another sort of issue area we wanted to explore with this survey, and in particular, how central should human rights be to the foreign policies of a country? And on this question, we get a lot of variation across countries, right? We ask people, should it be a top priority? Is it something that's important, but maybe not as important as other things? Or should it not be important at all? Now, there's not a lot of red up there, which means that not many people say human rights is unimportant, but there are big differences as far as whether it should be one of the most important priorities for our foreign policy or not. And again, it's actually that same distribution of countries we talked about a little bit earlier, right? It's Spain, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, then France and the UK, and then Italy, Poland, Hungary, Greece down at the bottom. So a wide variation in terms of how important should human rights be when we're making decisions about foreign policy. Development and sort of relations with developing countries, another area we wanted to explore. So we asked people about different types of kind of economic engagement with the developing world. Do you support increasing our companies' investment in the developing world? What about importing goods from the developing world? And then finally, increasing foreign aid to the developing world. So we see there's a lot of support for increasing investment from our domestic companies in other countries. So just about every country we get majority support for that. Importing goods from developing nations, maybe a little less support, especially in a few countries, but in most of the countries we get a majority at least saying, yes, I'm willing to import more goods from the developing world. And then a little bit more mixed reactions about foreign aid. I think it's a majority in most of the countries saying we're willing to increase foreign aid, although it's a pretty slim majority in lots of these nations. So I think the overall picture is that there's a willingness to kind of engage with the developing world, especially in economic terms, in terms of European public opinion. And then the last topic I wanted to touch on is just that we do see a lot of ideological divisions within many of these societies across probably most of the questions we asked in this report, and I'll just highlight a few of those for you. This is that question about whether you want to kind of look inward or outward. This is a percentage of people saying we should focus on our own problems here at home. And hopefully you can make out the dots here, but what it illustrates is that people who place themselves on the right side of the ideological spectrum are much more likely to say that they want to focus on our own country's problems than those on the left are. Big gaps, and 24 points in France, and more than 20 points in some other countries, double digits in most of the countries. So this is an issue where you do see some sharp ideological divisions between the right and the left. Same thing here on the refugee question, how big of a threat you see refugees coming into Europe. Much more of a concern on the right. You look at France, for example, 61% on the right say this is a major threat to our country, just 29% on the left. And again, double-digit differences between right and left in many of the countries that we surveyed in. And then a final one on human rights. Again, you see a big gap. People on the left much more likely to say that human rights should be one of the most important foreign policy goals for our country. So just to wrap up, I think that we do in many ways see divisions within Europe, right? We see these ideological divisions often within countries, and we see a divisions across countries with some real differences from country to country in terms of how they prioritize issues and how they approach foreign policy. So that obviously creates some challenges in terms of policy making. But there's also unity on certain questions as well. So if this is one part, as I said, is a series of reports we're putting out this summer. We hope tell a story about how Europeans see relations with the rest of the world and how they see some of the top challenges facing the continent. And I'll leave it there. I'm happy to talk about this in more detail during Q&A. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I first would like to ask David O'Sullivan for a few words and a short comment. Then we'll have Q&A conducted by Jacqueline Ayers, press officer from our embassy, and then to solidify the excellent ties that so happily exist between our two continents, we'll have some refreshments and some food outside. The which will be, to give you a time frame, 5:30. First day.
Well, thank you very much, Henne, and ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to both Henne and Peter for giving me this opportunity to be here on the occasion of this handover of the presidency of the Council of Ministers from Netherlands, one of our oldest member states, and an old hand at running presidencies. I have very good experiences of working with Dutch officials down through the years, and this time has been no exception. Henne mentioned a number of the achievements, which are not necessarily of earth-shattering international importance, but which have contributed to making Europe a better, safer, more efficient, more competitive place to live, which is what the work of the presidency is basically about. To one of our, I wouldn't say newest members, Slovakia has been a member for 12 years, but it's your first presidency. I'm definitely to say, I remember the first Irish presidency back in 1973, your first presidency, a bit like your first girlfriend, you never forget it. It's a unique experience, because it is the first time that you take over the responsibility of chairing the meetings, driving forward the agenda. And it's also a moment of great national pride. I mean, we all like to say we're Europeans, and we are, except for watching football. I see the match has gone into extra time, by the way, so I know you're all anxious to get out and see the 30 minutes. But it is a moment also for a country to suddenly realize what being in the European Union means, taking that responsibility, and it's a great opportunity to showcase your country, and I'm sure everyone will really relish the opportunity to visit Slovakia even more than they have. Bratislava is a wonderful city. I saw the transition from when I first visited there in 1990 when I was most recently back in 2008. What a transformation, due in part to membership of the European Union, if that makes sense. And I'd like to, and of course, as Henne wisely said, with his long experience in these matters, be careful, because you have your, one thing is your plan, and some general said, no plan long survives the first engagement with the enemy, and he reminded us of Harold Macmillan. I'm reminded of John Lennon, who said, life is what happens to you when you're making other plans. So the Slovak presidency will now have to face this issue of the British referendum and the consequences. And I'd like to thank our colleague from Pew for the excellent presentation of that survey. Can't be easy being a pollster these days. And I don't know, I always find that when polls give us the result we want, we consider them authoritative. When we They give us the results we don't like. We tend to say, well, I'm not sure about the methodology. Anyway, are polls accurate? To what extent do they predict events? In fact, the polls were fairly accurate on the British referendum, if the truth be told. And I take from that, I'm just going to make two quick comments, if I may. This is not a moment for long speeches. I mean, the first is that from the Pew Research that you see there, the very strong support for a strong role for the European Union in international relations. People do understand that in the 21st century, as José Manuel Barroso, the former president of the Commission, used to like to say, scale will count. And in a global situation where we're competing with the world's only superpower, our greatest ally, the United States, 320 million people, but when we're competing with China at 1.4 million, still counting, India, I don't know, 1.2, 1.3 billion, and still counting, Brazil, being a small to medium-sized European country, even frankly a large European country, does not necessarily give you the leverage or the ability to influence events, whether that's economics, whether that is politics, whether that's the projection of our values or the protection of our interests. And I think actually our people get that message. And that survey, to my view, shows that. Now that doesn't mean that we always deliver on the expectation, and there are many reasons why we could discuss that, but I think we should be aware of that. The second point I just wanted to make, because I hear a lot of talk out of the British referendum, immediate response is, of course, we need to start rethinking Europe, public disappointment, and views in the UK are not completely out of sync, as your other Pew survey showed, with some strong sentiments elsewhere in Europe of dissatisfaction, discontent with the European Union. Difficult sometimes to filter out how much of this is just general discontentment with life, with the economic situation, how much of it is really focused on the ills or misfortunes of the European Union. But in responding to that, I just want to remind everyone here, particularly as we're talking about transferring the presidency from one member state to another, the European institutions have to take the responsibility for what they manage. But the European Union, as we know it today, was not built by the European institutions. It was built by the member states. It was built by all of our member states. It is a profoundly democratic structure. Every decision which is taken by the Council of Ministers, democratically elected representatives of our governments, taking decisions on behalf of their people, directly elected members of the European Parliament. And if we have problems, some of those problems need to be discussed also at the level of member states. And if we're going to go out and talk now, as I think we must, about the consequences of the British referendum and how we take this European project forward, presumably now at 27 rather than 28, which we all regret, but that's the decision, then I think also this requires a vigorous debate at national level about why Europe exists, why it works the way it does, because if we wanted a truly federal Europe, we could have one. Trust me, the institutions will design you a federal Europe in 5 minutes. But it's not what people wanted. People wanted a halfway house, which by definition is not perfect, because if you want a structure in which member states and national governments still have a high degree of control, by definition, the decision-making process will not be as completely transparent as it would be if you had a fully federal system. But that's what people want, and I think they're perfectly entitled to want that. But then let's ask ourselves, maybe we need to explain this better. And I profoundly believe that in a general election, in a referendum, you cannot spend a large part of your time criticizing Europe, coming back from meetings in Brussels and saying, well, you're so lucky I was there, because if I had not been there, you would not believe what those people in Brussels were thinking of doing to you. Or saying, well, we got the right outcome, but my goodness, you are so lucky that I was the one there to get it for you. And you do that for 25 years. And then you turn around to people and say, oh, by the way, I need you to vote next week about what a great thing the European Union is. You agree, don't you? And forgive me, but in the debate in the United Kingdom, there were some fantastic speeches made on behalf of the European Union by Prime Minister Cameron, by Gordon Brown, by many people. But forgive me, I didn't hear those speeches a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And the lesson we have to draw from this is that if you want people to understand why we need Europe and why it delivers, we have to continuously remind them. Then let's change it if it isn't working. But let's start with the explanation of why we have built it in this way, why it delivers results, and why it is something to be defended and cherished, as Henne has said, something I profoundly believe in. So that there just just some thoughts as we have this handover between the two presidencies. I'm very grateful to be here, and I look forward to sharing in some of the largesse of the two presidencies. I gather it's going to be Slovakian wine and Dutch beer. The great dividing line in Europe is not football. It's the dividing line between beer and butter in the north and wine and olive oil in the south. So tonight we're going to get the best of both worlds. Thank you.
That's exactly right. Slovakian wine and Dutch beer. We'd like to open up the Q&A now for the floor, directed to the Pew Research Center data. Members of the media that are here, we have some availability after this event. So please ask your questions. If you could just show hands and state your name, that'd be great. There are some mics in the back of the room as well. Ask our own ambassador the first question.
No, I think that most of us will be, a lot of us will be very interested in the parallels that you found with the United States. You saw a couple of ones. I think a lot of people are afraid at the moment for a trend to isolationism. You saw that not very much in the United States, but in the EU, where a lot of people, as David said and you said, want to go outside. I think there is a role for the EU to go outside and represent, to be represented outside. What do you see happening in the US?
Yes. Well, I think that, as you said, in terms, it's an interesting sort of contrast. I mean, on the one hand, there's this desire for the EU to play this larger role on the world stage, and scale, and as you suggested, Ambassador, those are some issues that people are thinking about. Right, can be a big player in a way that my country can't. At the same time, though, there is this inward-looking tendency when you ask people about their own countries. A tendency in many countries, at least, for people to say, we really need to solve our problems here. And some of that certainly has to do with the economic challenges people have faced in recent years. That typically, if you're looking at public opinion over time, leads people when they're facing economic challenges to look inward and say that we got to pull back a little bit and take care of problems here at home. So we see that in Europe, and we do see it in the United States. I mean, there's some measures of what you might think of as isolationism that we've been tracking, and others have been tracking for half a century in the U.S. Questions that ask things like, essentially, should the U.S. mind its own business in the world and let other countries take care of their own problems? And some of those kind of measures have been at or near all-time highs over the last few years in the U.S. Again, I think people reacting to the economic downturn a few years ago, and also in terms of American public opinion, reacting to the weariness they feel about the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. So for a variety of reasons, we've also seen some turning inward in the United States, which of course is troubling to lots of people in the foreign policy elite who would argue that we need to engage with the rest of the world. I think another element that will be interesting to watch is specifically on the economic angle. As I think one of the slides I shared with you illustrated, the U.S. stands out compared to Europe as being a little more suspicious of economic globalization these days. And that's something we've certainly heard during the presidential campaign, both on the right, and, in terms of Donald Trump, and on the left from the Bernie Sanders campaign, or maybe more questioning than we've heard in a long time in American political conversations about the value of economic globalization. And I think those are all trends we'll need to look at.
All the way in the back.
My name is Richard Wike, Goethe Institute. I have two questions to your inquiry. One is to the social strata. Can you discover a kind of parallel or a kind of stratification among young people, millennials, what their attitude is towards, for example, looking more inward or looking more global, and the older generation, / also those who are apparently the losers, the older ones who have lost their jobs, or maybe not even the older ones, but a generation who lost their jobs. That's one question. And the second one is, what is the role of climate change in all those topics that you found out?
Sure. Well, your question about young people is a really important one. On some of the questions that we looked at today, and really lots of the questions we asked about international affairs in Europe and around the world, you do see millennials, you do see young people expressing pretty different viewpoints. Young people tend to want to engage with the rest of the world more than older people. They tend to say we need to take other countries into account and help other countries more so than their older counterparts. We see it when we ask about, for instance, the United States around the world. We see it when we ask about the European Union around the world. Young people tend to have more favorable views towards the EU. They tend to have more favorable views towards the US. They tend to embrace American soft power at greater rates than others. What's interesting is they also tend to be more positive towards China, for example. It's really just more of an international mindset and more open and positive about the rest of the world. So I always think that's kind of an upside in a way you can find in our data, is that young people do seem a little more open and positive about the rest of the world. In terms of climate change, we do see in this survey that Europeans tend to be more concerned about it than Americans are. Now, we did a big global survey last year that really went into detail on the climate change issue and released a report on that in the run-up to the Paris summit. And that was interesting because it also showed maybe Europeans are more concerned about it than Americans. But in a global context, often it's people in Latin America in particular and in sub-Saharan Africa who are the most concerned about climate change. And some would argue it's in the global south, in those areas of the world where you can see some of the biggest impacts of climate change. So, comparing the U.S. and Europe, you get one picture. But when you compare the U.S. and Europe to the rest of the world, you can see that the rest of the world may be even more concerned about that issue than people in the West.
Any more questions from the room? I have a question myself. Ambassador Sullivan touched on it in his remarks. How well were you able to filter out dissatisfaction of people with their own life in relationship to whatever they feel about Europe or the rest of the world?
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult thing to do in survey research. I mean, you can do some more statistical modeling and things like that to try to get at it. But I would say it's a big factor. I mean, if you look at things like life satisfaction, for example, and you try to measure that in Europe and the United States over the last several years, you haven't seen the kind of gains that you saw in middle-income countries that, at least until recently, were growing a lot economically, right? So, there's a big relationship between how people see economic progress in particular in their countries and in their lives, and how they feel about their lives, and in turn how they feel about conditions in their country. So, people's life experiences, the economic anxiety and uncertainty that they're feeling now, and they felt over the last few years, is a big driver, I think, of some of the dissatisfaction they see with the institutions and the dissatisfaction they see with governments and with the direction of things in their country.
Thank you so much.
Maybe one more question. I understand this survey was broader because I saw some other results like rating of Angela Merkel in Europe. My question is, she performed pretty well actually from the current state of affairs. So the question is, have you tried to survey the identity of the Europeans, whether the European identity prevails over the national identity, or what is the ratio?
Yeah. So, European identity versus national identity, that's something we tried once. We haven't done a lot on it. I think moving forward, that's something we really want to do. When we did it, several years ago, the national identity seems to prevail everywhere. Although I think Germany stood out as the one place where you had the biggest sense of European identity among the countries that we surveyed. But I think that would be a very interesting question for us to now go back and repeat again a few years later to see how these developments have affected it. And I think a good research question for us going forward is European identity. What does it mean to be a European, and how does that relate to your own national identity? As well as one of the things we like to look at sometimes is your religious identity. I mean, people have many different dimensions of their identity. So how does that how does the European element of that fit in? That's this topic we can look at more in the future.
Thank you very much for doing this for us. My name is Alena Taranova. I'm the US correspondent for public television Slovakia. There was one very interesting thing for me in that broad aspirational support for a more international active European Union question. UK showed 33% against and 55% pro. So how would you explain that a few weeks later we saw such a totally different outcome of the referendum?
Yeah, and of course this question really is about the role of the EU itself in world affairs, and doesn't get into the Brexit issue specifically. But to me, this question does represent an aspiration, and people are thinking about what is Europe's rightful role in world affairs. Europe together, of course, is a big political entity and an important entity. And to me, when people are answering this question, that's what they're saying: is that Europe deserves a seat at the table when the major powers in the future are going to be dealing with global issues. And even if they're dissatisfied with the institution, even if they're unhappy about sort of their own country's direction, on the big picture issue, Europe deserves a seat at the table among the great powers of the world. I think that's part, at least, of what people are saying when they answer that question.
All right, thank you very much. I think we're about to go to the other room and really have that beer in the Slovakian wine, can't we? So thank you so much.
Thank you.